the Labour government has big plans for GB Energy. It's been nearly a year since it was announced and created. You lead Great British Energy, and on 11th of June, under the spending review, you got an allocation of £5.8 billion. Great British Energy Nuclear, which is a separate entity with a separate governance, got £2.5 billion. So let's focus on the bit you run.
Yeah.
And give us a big picture. Say in 2035, 10 years from now, what do you hope GB Energy will have achieved?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and good morning, everybody. Look, Great British Energy is an innovation from a policy perspective, which, from my point of view, and starting really at the sort of the big picture and the motivation, is I think it's fundamentally a good idea to give British people a stake in the energy transition. I mean, we're here today because we see this as being one of the great economic opportunities of our times. And I think it is right, therefore, that we find ways to, create a dividend for British people. And I think that's a motivation in and of itself. But as an energy industry professional, and having worked in the sector pretty much all my career, I actually think there's a discrete role for a state actor. Because the private sector has been incredibly effective at mobilising and I think Chuka was just talking about the role of subsidies. It's been very effective where we've had sort of policy and political stability, wider economic stability, and things like the growth of offshore wind were possible partly because the conditions were quite benign. Mm-hmm. Whereas we look today, the world is more complex, and yet we have a series of mature technologies, and as we strive to achieve that energy security, independence, and abundance, we have a series of mature technologies which we know the private sector can mobilise. But there are some frontier technologies which we know we're going to need, which by 2035 need to become pretty mainstream, where private sector activity is comparatively low at the moment.
Right.
So we see a role for GB Energy to invest alongside the private sector to really target areas where there's a nascency in the technology. Obviously, we believe in the trajectory, so it's not speculative, it's fundamental, and we can talk about some of the examples. But the role that we can play to catalyse investment, to bring that additional confidence that, look, the UK government and as a country, we believe in the role of these technologies, and therefore we build our capability and our strategy around them.
So let's talk about specific technologies. You've said GB Energy is the first publicly owned company in 75 years, and you're very proud of being able to give it a shape and ability to do something. Now, £5.8 billion, a big sum, but let's put it in perspective. The clean energy mission, which is supposed to get the UK to 95% clean power by 2030, is going to be needing £200 billion in investment. Yeah. So how exactly do you plan to invest or spend this £5.8 billion for maximum impact?
So it's a really good point, because it is a large sum of money, and bear in mind this is a sum of money to start the organisation up, right? So our aspiration by 2035 is to start to build towards the scale of other comparable state-owned energy companies such as Ørsted or Vattenfall. So this is the sort of endowment that gets us moving. But you're right, we have to invest intelligently, and we know the cost of one offshore wind farm or a major investment is already in similar numbers. So we have to initially invest in sort of the spaces where we really think that can have maximum value. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We know by 2030, pretty much every offshore wind farm in the UK is going to have to be in water which is deeper than 80 metres. Now, that's quite a technical point, but basically what it means is that those wind farms are going to have to float, right? Which is, is an area of investment which is, at the moment, quite challenging. There's a significant amount of private sector capital deployed, but it's slowing down in its progress. So we're going to look to come in at that riskier stage of projects in their development phase, so prior to the major investment decisions, when we do expect private capital to come in, and we may deploy some of our capital as a minority partner, but ultimately to send a signal to the wider investment community that the UK government believes in the trajectory of these technologies, and we will believe in the long run, because it takes 4 or 5 years to get to the investment decision. So bridging that risky gap where you've got to go through consenting, where you've got to secure the grid connections, where you've got to go through that whole development at risk, that's a space where we think we can deploy, sums of capital which are meaningful, but then get you to the point where you can crowd in the private capital.
So what you're mentioning there is floating offshore, where you don't have these wind turbines actually tethered to the floor.
Yeah.
With a big concrete base, which is what current offshore tends to be. And the UK has a good track record in taking a frontier energy technology and then lowering its price. But the UK doesn't have a good track record on building businesses around those technologies. So there is no British company that's going around the world building offshore wind farms today.
I dispute that. I think there are some, SSE, for example.
Yeah, but they're not doing it at the scale that an Ørsted is doing, or Vattenfall, the two examples that you brought up, right? But Ørsted does that.
Yeah.
How exactly do you think with £5.8 billion could you create an industry or a set of companies, or maybe one big champion that would do floating offshore, not just in the UK, but globally?
Well, clearly we've got to work on how we target the investment around partners who we really believe can create that scale, and whether we can be part of that in terms of building capability and experience over time. But the other part, and the important narrative around GB Energy, is the role that we will play in co-investing in supply chains as well. Because ultimately, we've chosen to locate in Aberdeen for a reason. There is a really, really accomplished oil and gas supply chain, which is specialising in, amongst other things, everything that happens below the waterline. So I'm here talking specifically about floating offshore wind here. There is no offshore wind farm that's been built in the UK that hasn't had a role for some Aberdeen supply chain as part of it. So we think there's a role to build UK domestic champions in the technology that helps scale. And it isn't just isolated to wind. It's also, we can go beyond that and look at carbon capture and storage, or long duration energy storage, things that we know we're going to need in the future, but right now require some of that seed capital and that confidence in the projects to build through to the future.
So on 23rd of June, there was an additional announcement saying, at least in the press release, it said the government is announcing additional £700 million going to GB Energy for building up these supply chains. Is that new money? Is that additional money beyond the $500 billion?
It's part of our overall budget, but that we're allocating specifically towards supply chains. And
can you give me an idea of how exactly do you invest in creating that supply chain, like specific examples?
So part of it will be in the traditional way of supporting it with grants, and that will be a part of our business, which frankly is non-commercial. And then we also look to take equity positions. We'll work also with partners like the National Wealth Fund to look at how we can invest in companies that we believe in their technology, believe in their trajectory, and then support that with the pipeline of projects so that their technologies get deployed.
In this audience, you're going to have many investors, many banks. How have your conversations with those entities gone? Because you're going to have to co-invest with them, given you want to multiply the sum that you have been allocated.
Look, I've just come from a meeting this morning with a major, well-known UK bank and their sustainability practice, and genuinely, and this is one of the things that's really heartening for me, is that the inbound inquiries into GB Energy, the amount of people who are bringing us opportunities, is kind of proving that the fact that the market wants, and the role of this kind of long-termist, maybe greater risk appetite player in the market to work alongside the private sector. So look, I'm encouraged by the quality of the conversations, the breadth of the conversations that we're having with banks, with institutional investors, and ultimately with developers as well.
One thing we didn't talk about in the technology set is about 30% of UK's emissions come from burning gas in homes, home heating.
Yeah.
Is GB Energy going to look at decarbonizing heat, and how?
At the moment, look, our priority is probably around power, right, and electrification. And we're, over the next 3 to 4 months, we're going to be working and quite consultatively with the sector on understanding how we develop a long-term strategy. I mean, the last question to Chuka there was, what question do you get asked most? The biggest, most frequent question I get asked is, what's GB Energy going to do, right? And I need to answer that question in fairly short order. So, our intention is to be really, precise on where are the areas of technology that we're going to invest in. And I'd say another point on this, which is, look, if you look at those other European publicly owned energy companies like Ørsted and Vattenfall that have been set up, they all set up with a technology strategy around them. So, Vattenfall and Statkraft were hydro companies, Ørsted offshore wind, EDF nuclear, so on and so forth. So we need to, I think, create capability around certain technology fields. And right now, heat, we see ourselves as in the kind of business-to-business space. Heat is very much in the consumer space. That said, we do see scope for community and local energy within our strategy. It's certainly something that the government envisages being part of the strategy. And there will therefore be an intersection with the electrification of heat. And so we have to explore exactly how that might work in practice.
So it'll be your anniversary of creation on 5th of July in 2025. But in that period, what exactly have you built? There's one project announcement that I've seen around getting rooftop solar for schools and for hospitals. Mm-hmm. What else?
So to be precise, the anniversary of the government is on the 5th of July. That's right. We actually got royal assent. I can't remember exactly the date, but it was something like the 11th of May. So our legal existence is a matter of weeks rather than a year. Having said that, it's not like we've been doing nothing. So we've been building the organisation up, recruiting people, which is an important place to start, and also prioritising some early activities. So one of you referenced the Rooftop Solar scheme, and this is an area where we're really looking to learn and build capability. So we've chosen to invest part of our budget into investing in around 200 schools and hospitals, rooftop solar schemes. And the effect of these is really interesting, because we went to visit one hospital in Hull, which had built a 5 megawatt array on a field that it just had next to the hospital. And they're fortunate enough to have the capital available to do it. But it's saving them about just under £2 million a year, which funds about 50 Band 5 nurses or 30 fully qualified doctors. So it's an outcome. It's using energy and sustainability as a vehicle to achieve a better outcome. And equally, I went to a school in Sheffield, right in the middle of a pretty deprived area, where they were able to fund teaching assistants and so you're improving educational outcomes, and they're engaging the kids in it. So this is a really logical thing that we should do more of. Now, these first investments really help us learn and see what the scope and the potential of this is, but we see the local aspect of how we can use public sector real estate as effectively an anchor tenant to build smart local energy networks as a business model that can be scaled and can be outcome focused, as well as just being about purely electricity.
And you said the word invest, but my understanding is this is grant money.
This is initial grant money, but it's the long-term runway for this is how do we turn this into a business?
And what of the £5.8 billion will be roughly grants, and what will be invested in companies?
We're about £1 billion in grants altogether, albeit we will work intelligently with the business community to see whether actually where is the grant the right solution, where actually equity could be a better solution. So we'll try and have a degree of flexibility in how we approach that.
Another thing that we haven't talked about is transmission. Now, in the £700 million announcement on supply chain building, there was a mention that transmission would be included in that spending. Transmission is a key bottleneck for electrification in the UK. There's too much
Sure.
wind in Scotland and there's much more demand in the south, the Clean Energy Mission and the department have a plan to try and build more transmission cables going up and down. How exactly does GB Energy take part in this? Is it in just traditional investments, or is it advanced technologies? Because there are quite some very interesting ideas for taking the same cable and sending 3 times the amount of power in them, for example.
I think the short answer is both. I mean, I think we have to act in the short term to alleviate capacity in the market and build capacity, and it's actually part of our sort of energy independence narrative, because look, the reality at the moment is that people building wind farms or transmission networks are competing with transmission operators in other markets for factory slots. And interestingly, I don't think it's just about factory capacity, it's also about skills capacity. I mean, electrical technology is probably the most complex part of the value chain in terms of understanding and building capability. And so we've got to work actually quite coherently here in terms of, on one hand, building out capacity in the short term, building skills that can act alongside that, and we won't do it on that on our own, because there's a big ecosystem of actors around building skills. But in the long run, when I think what's going to ground capacity here in the UK for 20, 30, 50 years, it's going to be innovation. We don't. If you look at the aerospace industry, has we make wings, we make landing gear, we make avionics, and so on and so forth, and propulsion systems in the UK, because we have the best innovation ecosystem that drives that. It's not because we're a low-cost country or we buy more planes than anyone else. We just have to build deep capability. So for me, it's really important that when you're looking to add manufacturing, you add that manufacturing as part of an ecosystem, which is or an innovation pathway, which is then becomes self-sustaining.
So we've talked about the idea that GB Energy could try and unlock more private capital, could try and advance some of the frontier technologies. But one driving principle that this government has been trying to work on is to lower the cost of energy.
Yeah.
How exactly does GB Energy satisfy that need?
Well, I've always believed from the beginning that lowering energy costs is a national endeavour. It's not. You can't sort of delegate that responsibility to one organisation. So the role I think we can play, partly we've talked about already, which is about crowding in the private capital. I mean, ultimately, the private capital, the more we crowd that in, it will bring more competition, it will bring more availability. But it also, I think, the other area that then is helping to alleviate capacity constraints in the supply chain. And then the third area where I see us playing a role is doing more to build these really sort of potentially transformative smart local energy systems, where we bring at the moment the limit to those being built out further is much more about capital availability and the business models and the bankability. It's not about technology, it's not about innovation, it's just about how do we turn this into a model which makes it accessible to more social housing providers, more local authorities, more hospitals. So we might not necessarily be there focused on the overall system, but it'll be about how do we bring targeted benefits to the communities within which we can work. And ideally, that is a scalable thing which we focus on those that need it most in the first instance.
So we started the conversation by talking about, let's lay out what would be specific achievements that you think GB Energy will have in 2035. Now, we've gone through sort of the ideas that you have, but let me come back to that question, because you didn't paint a specific enough set of achievements that you would hope. And I'm not saying you know what will happen, but if you were to dream, what would be the 2035 achievements that you'd be proud of?
Look, I mean, let me start with the local angle, because we just talked about it. I would like to see, right the way across the country, smart systems where we're integrating solar on schools or on private businesses or on local authority land, together with battery storage and maybe some EV charging. We've got a big challenge in bringing EVs to people who don't have off-street parking, for example. So how do we bring those things together, turn them into business models which ultimately allow people to get access to that at sensible prices, and sort of democratize the electrification of of society to as many people as possible. So that I would like to see Great British Energy's logo on hospitals and schools right the way across the country, and other local community organisations. I would like to see us invested in these frontier technologies that we know that we need. I'd like to see floating offshore wind farms spinning in the North Sea with supply chains behind them, thriving in the northeast of Scotland and Aberdeen, where we've helped alleviate the impact of transition, and make sure that creates jobs and opportunities for people who may be affected by the decline of some other industries. And I'd like to have some really smart British companies exporting their know-how, and maybe GB Energy as part of that ecosystem, exporting that know-how to other countries, and whether that's in long duration storage or carbon capture and storage, I think the scope for that, 10 years, that's my mission.
Now, the initial announcement when it was made was GB Energy will have £8.3 billion. You've had to give up 2.5 billion of that to GB Energy Nuclear. Does that undermine your ability to live up to this dream?
Yeah, to turn that into a negative, I mean, ultimately, the founding statement was very clear that there would be, there'd be a joint element of it. But look, we're starting the company up. We secured £6 billion. That is a lot over 4 years to catalyse a company. So I don't, I see that budget as a huge, actually a challenge to think, how do we deploy that intelligently and maximise the impact and the return, whether that's on jobs, on growth, on returns. That's a huge opportunity for us, and I certainly don't see it as an inhibitor, put it that way.
So last question for you, perhaps the most difficult one. Your title has Interim CEO in it. GB Energy, the government created it on 5th July 2024. You say the legal entity didn't exist until May, but you've been interim CEO since March. For energy companies, there should be no shortage of applicants wanting the job of a CEO, wanting to build a vision that you've just painted. Why is it taking so long to get a full-time CEO?
Why is it taking so long? Look, I mean, interim came in because about speed. Actually, it was about wanting to stand the company up quickly. And I work in the industry, and I'm incredibly enthusiastic about this. So to be asked to come and go on loan, as it were, to do this was a huge privilege. And then, to be honest, the really important point is that when you go through these appointments in the public sector, there has to be a thorough process. And that process, for anyone who's ever worked for the government, will probably understand that process is not something that you can do overnight. So it takes time, but it's I think it should be clear soon. Put it that way.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much indeed.